It's not every day that we get to speak to a U.S. Senator.
Well, no, it's not every day our audience gets to listen to a U.S. Senator.
Good point. Senator Joe Donnelly on today's episode. I'm Noah Stubbs.
And I'm Zach Evans.
And this is Canvas. We're sitting here with Senator Joe Donnelly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, we wanted to talk to you quickly about the hot topic that seems to be roaring through the country with the recent death of Supreme Court Justice Scalia. What is the current mood of the Senate? We've heard from Senator McConnell. He recently said that the American people should have a voice in the selection of their next Supreme Court justice. What's going on?
Well, first and foremost, I would like to extend my condolences to Justice Scalia's family.
Sure.
He served our country for a long time, and we're grateful for his service. In regards to Senator McConnell, the American people do have a voice in this process. The American people elected United States senators to do their job. And so the Constitution requires me as a United States senator to vote on nominations that come over from the president, and to vote up or down, to have hearings, to be able to determine the person's positions on various issues, and to vote. And so that's what I hope to do. It's my job is to vote on the president's nominations. That's what the Constitution requires me to do. That's what I expect to do.
Do you think that there is a divide? Are Republicans, do you expect them to follow Mr. McConnell?
I would hope that all of my colleagues would take a look at this and understand our obligations. And I think that's starting to happen. You're hearing some of my Republican friends also saying, we should have hearings on this. We should take a look at this. It is going to be 340 days till the end of President Obama's term. If we were to wait, we would go 340 days without a justice. In addition to that, the new president would have to then consider their own nominee, get that person over, have a confirmation hearing. So you might be out up to a year and a half. And that's not what was intended with our system. Whoever is the next president will get a chance to nominate Supreme Court justices in their term of office. We have a president in place, we have a Senate in place, and we have an obligation to do our work.
It sounds like the Republicans are spinning this narrative that there's going to be an ultra-liberal judge nominated. Do you think if President Obama nominated someone more moderate, that it'd be more palatable to them?
I think what you're going to find is that the nomination will be to someone who is moderate, because I think President Obama understands that an ultra-liberal judge will not only get any support, will get no support from Republicans and from Democrat senators like myself. I'm not a Democrat or Republican first. I'm an American first. I'm a Hoosier first. And I want a judge who reflects Hoosier common sense. And so that's someone who's moderate, who's willing to listen to both sides. And that's what my expectation is, that the president will pick someone who, in effect, for a sports metaphor, hit it down the middle.
Now, throughout this nomination and confirmation process, I think we're all talking about the presidential race. Do current Senate races, does that play into a factor on how the confirmation process, just throughout the confirmation process, does it affect it at all?
Well, I think the one effect it might have is it will show current senators' views and candidates' views on the role of the Senate in regards to Supreme Court confirmations. And my view on this is, I think, a pretty moderate view, which is, look, whether it's a president like President Bush or a president like President Obama, you send me a nomination during a time that a Supreme Court justice spot is open, then it's my obligation to study it, to look at it, and to vote.
You come off as a middle-of-the-road kind of guy, bipartisan senator. I have to ask your opinion on the direction of the country. With the presidential election, it seems like the establishment, rather the anti-establishment candidates, are getting a lot of noise, the Donald Trumps, the Bernie Sanders. What effect do you think that's going to have on the country as a whole, regardless of who wins in November?
Well, I think the country is strong and will remain very, very strong. But what you're seeing is a very understandable reaction to things like Alcoa, where you go into work You've given your whole heart and soul to a company for 20, 25 years, and Alcoa is struggling right now, and you no longer have a job. And you go, I've held up my end of the deal. The American promise of a good job. You work hard for your company, you do everything right. You shouldn't be in a position where 20 years in, you have to wonder whether you can keep your home. We just had a situation in Indianapolis and in Huntington, Indiana, with Carrier and with the company UTEC, both divisions of United Technologies. United Technologies announced last week over $7 billion in earnings. Their CEO said, our earnings hit the high end of expectations. And at the same time that happened, they announced they were going to fire 2,100 workers in our state because they were going to move the jobs to Mexico to get lower wages. And the question you have to ask is, when is it enough? High end of expectation earnings. How do you tell someone who's done everything right for you for the last 30 years, who has gone to work, built great furnaces, built great electrical boards, in effect lived and breathed to make sure the company did well, that shareholders did well, and now you tell them, hey, we don't need you anymore. That's why you're seeing some of this anger is people just want a fair deal. They just want to know, if I give you everything I've got, I'll be treated with respect in return.
Now, during recent presidential elections, I think one of the hot topics is the youth vote. You're not currently up for election, and I certainly don't want you to speak for any of your colleagues or anybody else, but does that play into campaigns and elections, just the youth vote?
Well, everybody's vote is important. And what we're trying to do is make sure that young people get registered, that their voice is heard, because young people are going to have such an influence over this country, are going to be so affected by what happens. And another part of why you are seeing things like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders is a lot of young people graduated from college in 2008, 2009, when our economy had been put on its knees because of the horrendous actions of Wall Street and the terrible conduct of some investment bankers. And they look and they go, I've worked like a dog. I studied for 4 years. I have $100,000 in debt, and now I can't get a job. They've been through tough times, and they just want to make sure that that everybody has a shot at the American dream.
To wrap this up, Senator Donnelly, I don't know if you recall, but it was last March, you and I met on the streets of Selma, Alabama.
Yes.
We talked about voting.
Reverend Brooks was there with us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a year later I'm just curious, when can Congress pass a reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, especially after the Supreme Court cut down key provisions?
I'll vote tomorrow for it. We have to have it brought before us. We have to discuss it. And one of the very saddest figures I know of is that in 2014, out of 50 states, Indiana was 50th in voter turnout. That of the 4 or 5 most important steps to increase voter turnout, Indiana has laws that are the exact opposite of that. And so we have, in effect, on a number of ways, seem to actively discourage people from turning out to the polls. Some states have, places like Oregon, have turnout 65, 70%. And my view has always been, the more my neighbors who turn out, the better for everybody. The more everybody wants to be part of the system, the better off the system works. And so I'm all in to get that done right away.
Okay.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Well, I
really
just want to
appreciate
say how great it is to be back in Evansville again. I'm very blessed to be down here on a regular basis and have such wonderful friends down here.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
You know, Zach, I'm a little bit disappointed.
Why?
Well, you're wearing the bun right now, and you were wearing a tie. You never do that for any other episode, but when a senator comes,
Well, I also wore my nice socks today. You got to go all out.
Yeah, I didn't notice the socks. So, well, we just sat down with Senator Joe Donnelly, and what you heard was just a small portion of what we talked about in an editorial board meeting. Zach, why don't you recap what else he said?
Well, Senator Donnelly came through to speak with our editorial board while Congress is on recess this week about various issues. This is midway through his first term. He was elected in 2012, and his term expires in the end of 2016 or 2018, rather. I'm sorry. Donnelly touched on a lot of topics from um, bills he's helped push through regarding veterans' mental health, to bills that relate to prescription drug overdoses like heroin and opana and opioid painkillers, and how there might be legislation being voted on in Congress this year about limiting the number of prescription pills given per, I guess, prescription
Per fill.
per fill. That's the better phrase.
Yeah, drugs seem to be a topic, a big topic. Because
Well, it should be, yeah.
he also talked about meth too.
Yeah, right. And there's not as much as the federal government is doing about meth as they seem to be doing about heroin and opioid abuse. Seems like the meth issue is being left more up to the states. But he did say that they're working on providing federal grant monies to law enforcement and prosecutors' offices around the country to give them more cash to fight the cause. But with in Indiana, and as it's starting to pop its head up in Vanderbilt County, we have had more of a meth issue. But painkiller abuse and heroin abuse is on the rise, and overdose deaths are on the rise.
Mm.
So it's a really strong emerging issue across the country, and especially here in Indiana.
Sure. So what else? What else did we hear about?
Well, Senator Donnelly sits on the Armed Services Committee, and so of course we talked about ISIS,
Mhm.
and he talked about how ISIS poses a clear and present danger to world security, and how we need to get them out of Iraq and then get them out of Syria. But I guess he was talking about the way to really tackle ISIS is the dollars.
Yes.
Cut off their funding, squeeze them tighter, which he said will eventually play into the dedication of the fighters. If their pay is reduced, is that really going to make them willing to fight for their cause?
Yeah, and I think he referenced what was I believe it was an Associated Press article about how that's already happening.
Right.
How ISIS members are taking pay cuts, basically, which is crazy to think about. You really don't think about the finances of ISIS, but that seems to be according to him and other officials that you read about, it seems to be the way to sort of start this process of eliminating them.
Mm-hmm. I do want to say we did talk in depth about the Supreme Court nomination, as we did in our interview
Sure.
with him. And as I was talking with you before we started recording, I was kind of surprised at his opinion regarding what's going on. I expected a more hardline, Republicans are being obstructionists, they're not doing their job. But he took a middle of the road approach and said, I think things are starting to change. I think people were just being very reactionary at the immediate news of his death, of Scalia's death.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, that was interesting too. That was very surprising to me as well. But taking the bipartisan approach, perhaps he is not only telling us how it is, but perhaps through us reaching out to other senators and sending a message of bipartisanship through our broadcast too.
Yeah, Senator Donnelly, it really is his MO is bipartisanship, it seems. And he cited a study, and I didn't get the chance to jot down the specifics, but a study that ranked him as being the most bipartisan senator in decades.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was interesting to learn. That's a rank he holds as being the most bipartisan, which is interesting in an age that we see our country and our Congress especially as being split down the middle and refusing to work with each other and voting along party lines on every way they can.
Yeah, well, and he did mention, and this is true from our studies that we've both been through. We both pretty much were brought up through the same chute, if you will. But he did mention that the Senate was less partisan than Congress. Obviously, in Congress you have certain districts throughout the state that are gerrymandered, that are drawn up specifically for a particular party. With the Senate, you have just the state. Those are your constituents. So it would only make sense that the Senate would be less partisan, but to be the most bipartisan, member of the Senate. That's an accomplishment.
I would say so. Bringing it back to what we were talking about in our Canvas interview with him about voting, he mentioned Oregon as having 65% voter turnout rate. The interesting thing about Oregon, and it's also happening in Washington State and Colorado now, people can just mail in their ballots. They have boxes located in Oregon, all in their city, just like mailboxes. You just drop your ballot off whenever you want to.
Huh.
They've made voting super easy. And I'm not saying that it's hard here with early voting a month ahead of the polls, but perhaps if Indiana would consider such a measure of allowing of everybody to mail in their ballots, not as absentees, but just as as a regular voter, that our voter turnout would increase. It's pretty pathetic that we had the lowest voter turnout in the entire union in 2014, and I wonder what it's going to be like in 2016.
I'm not going to say that it's difficult to vote because it's not, but it just seems like there are a lot of unnecessary measures or perhaps tired measures, old measures that still in place to keep us, waiting in lines to vote.
Sure.
Will that change? I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, the voter ID laws, Indiana
Yeah.
is definitely a voter ID state. We require an ID for your ballot to be counted unless there's a religious objection,
Sure.
which is honored. But otherwise, you have to have a valid ID for your vote to count.
Well, even getting to the polls sometimes, just finding a ride. I know that you and I both have cars, but not everybody in the city, not everybody in the state has a car.
Oh, yeah.
And even to ride the bus, you have people with disabilities, you have older folks. Even getting to the polls from in a 12-hour period can prove to be a challenge. Perhaps mailing in your ballot or just dropping it off at your convenience. Perhaps that would simplify things.
I think so. And it brings up another point is, you and I have jobs where it's part of our job to go to the polls on
Sure.
election day because
Yeah.
that's part of our coverage.
Yeah.
But we get the chance to actually go out there and vote ourselves. Not every job, they're supposed to allot time to allow their employees to
Yeah.
vote. Does it happen? I don't know. Or is are employers telling their employees they can't vote? Probably not, but there's the perception there that an employee feels bad for taking what can be 30 minutes to an hour,
Sure.
especially if we're talking around lunch, what's a busy time, to
Yeah.
go vote. I mean, there's got to be a significant impact there that people can't vote because of their jobs. Canvas, the Courier and Press's news podcast, is produced by Noah Stubbs and Zach Evans.
Check us out on courierpress.com, the Courier Press app, and podcast apps like iTunes, Pocket Cast, and Stitcher.